The best words in sports. Game 7 will be taking place in the NBA Finals on Sunday night in OKC after a dominant Game 6 victory at home by the Indiana Pacers to the tune of a 108-91 scoreline. What a win for them. And there were a lot of characteristics and certain aspects of the game that define that outcome, specifically in terms of not just the players but the collective effort, which has always been the narrative surrounding this feisty Pacers team who never says die. And on the other side of things, for OKC, in their first closeout opportunity, kind of turning in a clunker of performance in a situation where if they closed out the Pacers on the road, it might have looked a bit better in hindsight when we looked back on this NBA Finals. But now it is a Game 7 that we have on our hands on Sunday night. But I want to talk about this Game 6 because there were a lot of things that, in my eyes, worked wonders for the Pacers and is something that they'll have to try and replicate on the road in Game 7. And then for the Thunder, a couple of things that I'm kind of worried about this late in this series, especially considering that despite the fact that they've had games like this in these playoffs against Denver, against Minnesota, and have come back following the loss and come out better than ever, there are still some factors, considering the fact that this is the first time this young core has been in this final setting, that might seep into their play yet again in Game 7 in a winner-take-all situation. Not just in the prior rounds of these playoffs, but specifically in this setting. First off, I want to talk about the narratives that kind of got solved here. First being the Halliburton injury and what he would look like in this specific game. Because without Halliburton coming out for the 23 minutes that he did, I'm not sure that many Pacers players would have played with the same energy and intensity had he not been on the court. But in those 23 minutes, he made his impact felt. He had 14 points, I believe. He had 5 assists. Really Halliburton-like performance, despite the fact he was working through pain. He really stepped up his game, and his teammates, in response, performed around him very well. The other narrative that was kind of answered, despite the fact that Halliburton looked good, is with McConnell, should Halliburton, not necessarily play too many minutes, not necessarily look iffy, but not necessarily play the amount of minutes we know he can, would McConnell then step up his intensity and be able to maintain that for more minutes than he might be accustomed to? And that was answered to a T. Because it was his minutes specifically, especially in the second half, where he went on an 8-point run in just 11 minutes of play on the court. And it really bolstered this team in Halliburton's absence. And so those two players specifically, Halliburton and McConnell, who I talked about in terms of we're going to have to define this specific game, really stepped up their intensity. But now let's talk about the collective effort here, specifically by the Pacers' defense. The key statistic, in my opinion, in this series has been turnovers and points off turnovers. OKC has been the much better side, in my opinion, in terms of taking care of the ball, and the Pacers have been kind of careless. But they do realize that if they do take care of the ball, they ultimately have a chance. And that's exactly what they did. I'm not going to include the fourth quarter in a lot of my statistics going forward in this specific segment, just because the fourth quarter was kind of a dud and both benches were emptied at that point. But look at the discrepancy in turnovers. I can't give you at the spot the points of turnovers, but I do know that the first 3 quarters, the quarters that mattered, the quarters when the majority of the Pacers starters and top reserves were on the floor, that only committed 2 turnovers. The Thunder, on the other hand, yes, the stats were kind of inflated in the fourth quarter as their bench was out there and they really weren't playing as tough as they could have. They had 21 turnovers. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, most importantly, matched his regular season career high with 8 turnovers, a rarity for a player of his caliber. But when we get down to specific tactical moves that Rick Carlisle and his team pulled off, it's just being able to fight through the ball screens and getting into the paint to disrupt Shai's drives downhill. Because Shai's bread and butter in this series has been splitting between 2 defenders, getting to his spots, and being comfortable in the paint. Where they took that away from him very well, and thus the Pacers' defense had a fantastic night. On the other end of the floor, they were fantastic in transition on both makes and misses for the Thunder, and most importantly, their drive and kick game was working. And I have to credit 2 players offensively as well for the Pacers here, outside of, the Halliburtons, McConnells, and Siakams of the world for stepping up. Andrew Nembhard, man, what a player this guy can be when he's getting going offensively, because we all know how much of a stud he is defensively as well. Because once he gets his 3-point shot going, chances are the Pacers have a solid option in Nembhard to generate points as quickly as possible. So Andrew Nembhard stepping up, hitting 5 threes with 17 points was a major, major plus for the Pacers in terms of their depth, really rising to the occasion at home with the fans behind them. Another player who was actually the leading scorer for the Pacers in this one. How about Obi Toppin, another guy who could get going and space the floor really well. This game, not necessarily with his traditional drive to the rim and heroic dunks in that magnitude, but really getting going from beyond the arc himself as well. And overall, those 2 players, when they're really in their groove, can be vital assets to developing the rhythm of the game for the Pacers. That's what they did to a T. Remember, the Pacers in this game started off putrid. They didn't make a single field goal, I believe, in the first 2 minutes. They missed their first 5 field goals, and they were down 10-2. But once they found their rhythm, there was no stopping them last night. And it's part and parcel for all the players who really stepped up and rose to the occasion, like the Nembhards, like the Toppins, like even the Ben Shepherds of the world, stepping up and playing their specific parts. Now let's go to the Thunder side of things. And if you're a Thunder fan, obviously you're not necessarily feeling too good about this, but I will talk about how in Game 7 they should still have the clear advantage, despite the fact the Pacers might be the more confident team headed to OKC. But on the Thunder, the 2 main worries for me is the margin of their loss and their 3-point shooting. Let's start with the margin of loss. Specifically, those first couple of minutes in the third quarter where both them and the Pacers weren't getting their shots, because that perfectly segues into their lack of 3-point shooting. So, if you recall, in the first 4 minutes of the third quarter or so, the Thunder did not hit a field goal. However, in that same span of time, the Pacers didn't even make a field goal themselves. In fact, I believe they only had like a couple of free throw attempts, and maybe even 1 or 2 makes, but not a field goal make in those 4 minutes. The Thunder in that opportunity could have closed a deficit at the time was only about 20 points. And in the third quarter, if they pound on the Pacers early, who knows what that fourth quarter would have looked like with the Pacers potentially being the tenser team, the Thunder being able to put more impactful players out on the court. So those 4 minutes in the third quarter where neither team scored, yet the Thunder could have made a little dent in the Pacers' lead, were highly pivotal, in my opinion, in the outcome of the game. Because even if the Thunder didn't even come out to win, at least putting pressure on the Pacers would have felt good in those moments. But alas, it was not to be. Then we go into the three-point shoot. Obviously, like I said, the stats would be inflated by the fourth quarter because of the benches being emptied out. But before the fourth quarter, the Thunder only made 3 out of 20 three-point field goals. That is appalling for the Thunder. And obviously, it's not like this is going to happen every single game. But if you can only make 3 3-pointers with your starting 5 and potentially 3 of your best reserves on the floor for 3 quarters, that's something that you have to figure out. And I know that the Thunder are not an elite 3-point shooting team, but at the very least, you have to find a way to generate offense from beyond the arc should the Pacers continue to play like this in Game 7. Because the Pacers really were opportunistic beyond the arc themselves. They didn't necessarily have the best shooting night themselves from beyond the arc, only 14 of 35 at the very least. That kind of made a difference when you look at it from a math perspective, despite the large margin. So, I'm OKC. You have to figure out ways to find players who can be able to be consistent from beyond the arc. I'm looking at guys like Caruso. I'm looking at guys like Dort. Jalen Williams can get going. Chet Holmgren, if he spaces the floor with his three-point shot, that opens up a lot of what OKC can do down low. So that will be Mark Daigneault's primary focus heading into Game 7, in my opinion. But let's get back to this Pacers team. Because when we talk about the margins in this series, the margins that have mattered have been turnovers, have been the pace of the game, so things as assists really matter, and most importantly, the points you can generate in transition. Like I said, I don't have all the stats here. I'm just going through ESPN's article to see if I can find them. But you can imagine the fact that the Pacers really had to, if they were going to win this Game 6, truly dominate every facet, and that's exactly what they did. So, in my opinion, heading into Game 7, and if you're the Indiana Pacers, you really have to... I can't really find the stats, and that kind of sucks because they were good ones, but it is what it is. Anyways, heading into Game 7, for the Indiana Pacers, you have to find a way on the road where you are still 7-4, but not as dominant as you are at home, to get back into that rhythm, right? Because I can't imagine the Thunder, who have been absolutely superlative at home, especially following a loss in the postseason, 10-2 at home, 18-2 following a loss in the postseason thus far, with 12 of those wins coming by 10 or more points. You, as the Pacers, have to continue to formulate ways to put pressure on this young team. Because that's the one thing that I believe the Pacers have going for them. They at the very least have players who have been in the league for quite some time, who have had the experience. They have a champion on their roster in Pascal Siakam. So, just being able to know that being the more confident and potentially more experienced team in these specific closeout situations could pay off for them. As for the Thunder, they have history on their side. They have their own history on their side, for that matter. And I do have the stats here for OKC in terms of their home record, in terms of home teams going into Game 7. So like I mentioned before, the Thunder are a 10-2 team. And obviously, if it weren't for a couple of last-second heroics by specific teams, they could have been 12-0. They have a plus 20.6 point differential at their home court. And obviously, on the road, they really suffer. And most importantly for the Thunder, their three-point shooting at the very least is decent at best, which could pay dividends in a game where they need to have the three-point shooting going, because at home they made 37.5% of their threes compared to 29.9% on the road. For the Pacers, they actually have been a decent road team. It doesn't show up stat-wise because they have a minus 0.5 point differential on the road, but they're still 7-4, like I said. But their backs are up against it, truly because of the fact that they may have just expended one of the best games of their season thus far at home to even get to this point. And Halliburton's calf injury could still be lingering in this one. But I don't necessarily think that would matter as much should the Pacers dictate the tempo at the start of the game. That's going to be looking for, because the Pacers have really started slowly in almost every single series in this postseason before ramping up their offensive pressure to be able to either make these big comebacks or even start to build their own big leads. So the narrative is going to be centered around which team, the feisty underdog who has been battling to get to this point, or the heavy favorite who now is under a lot of pressure, specifically in a final setting, their first time in this atmosphere, to close out this series at home. And when you think about it that way, it could favor the Pacers. So you can't really determine whether or not certain narratives will come alive in Game 7. What I do know is that these have been the two best teams of 2025, and it is a deserving final send-off to the 2025 NBA season that the two best teams in this specific calendar year are meeting in a winner-take-all matchup. So that's all that matters, in my opinion. Even if you're the Pacers, who have been the underdogs for the entirety of this postseason. Even if you're the Thunder, who may be feeling a bit tense right now, know they can control their own destiny in front of a familiar crowd. If you're both teams, don't think of Game 7 as a stigma. Think of it as an opportunity. Because it's the first Game 7 in nearly a decade, and that's a very famous Game 7 we're talking about here. LeBron James and company's famous 3-1 comeback against one of the best regular season teams of all time. So you can't necessarily put Game 7's past in your perspective, because this is a relatively new finals experience for a lot of the players. This is small market finals that we did not expect at the start of the year, that both teams have put a lot of effort into. So now all that matters is that you have to relieve any pressure you may feel from your mind and just go into it as any other game. That's all the advice I can give these two teams that have never been in this situation before. The team that can steady their nerve, the team that comes out with more energy, the team that wins the margins will ultimately be the NBA champion. And for either of these teams, for potentially Indiana especially, looking for their first ever title after not having been to this point since a quarter century ago with Reggie Miller, and even for the Thunder, who have finally found a big three that's a little bit less unselfish than prior ones, that can rely on a star who's bringing back a certain aesthetic to the NBA, and for what it means to the league as a whole, because it truly means that no matter who wins, and even if the Thunder do win, we go on to say they're one of the greatest teams of all time, that there is parity to be had here, that the league can feel as if it's resurrected if it's a good Game 7, which I want it to be, but as the series goes, it's whoever dominates the margins, and we could see an early big lead for either of these teams. But most importantly, we're getting the two best words in sports, and maybe in the history of the world, a Game 7. And that's all that matters for both teams, both fan bases, and for the NBA at large. But we'll just about do it for today's edition of Sporting Views. I cannot wait for Sunday night. One for all the marbles in OKC. But we have a lot of sports news to cover throughout the coming days towards the end of the month. The FIFA Club World Cup will be heading into the knockout rounds. We're going to see who the favorites are there. Some transfer rumors starting to arise amongst some of Europe's top teams. Then we're going to get into the NBA and NHL and NFL off seasons in the coming weeks ahead, as both the NFL and even the NBA, despite the fact that it's ending on Sunday, it almost feels like everything that's going to matter about the NBA in the coming weeks is going to be happening right around the corner. We have the draft on Wednesday specifically, so a lot of exciting NBA news to talk about. But, as always, thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you soon.